Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last day of 3 days to paid. Hopefully you all are doing well. Let me know if you can hear me okay. If you can just write in the chat just to make sure that you can hear me and see me okay before we get rolling. We're also going to make sure that we're streaming on YouTube as well, which it looks like we are. Excellent. All right. I'm excited to get into today's content. We have a lot of great stuff to cover, so we'll dive in shortly. What I want to do first, just like the last two sessions, I want to go over just a few housekeeping things, just in case maybe this is someone's first day out of the 3-day boot camp. So the first thing is the handout. So every webinar, I like to have a handout. Same thing as normal. If you go up to the top and click on the handouts tab, you can download the handout from today. And then also in there, we talked about proposal templates and contract templates yesterday. If you did not have a chance to download the templates from yesterday, you can also click on the handouts and download those templates as well. It is important really quickly that when you click download on them, you want to make sure you're logged into your Dubsado account so that way they get uploaded into your account. So feel free to click on those handouts, download those into your Dubsado account. For all of my YouTube viewers, the links to the templates and the handout are in the description of this video. So if you need to download that or want to, you can just click on the links in the description. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is how these webinars typically work, how we've been doing them is I will walk through all of my content first. And then at the very end, I'll open it up for Q&A so I can answer any questions that you have over what we cover today. And there probably will be some good questions because today we're going to be talking about the client experience, putting everything together and sending it out to a potential lead, or a potential client. So with that being said, I'm going to dive in here and get started, and we'll start moving through everything. So let me share my screen with you, and that should pop up there. All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and get started here. The last day, like I said, day 3, we're wrapping everything up today. So we'll get started. Now, just another quick recap of what we've covered so far. Day 1, we talked about your settings, getting those set up, along with projects and clients, putting your services and payment plans in your brand. Day 2, we really talked about forms. So yesterday was really big on capture forms, contracts, and proposals. And now today, like I said, we're going to talk about combining the proposal, contract, and invoice together. And then we're also going to talk about what it looks like on the back end and then on the front end and go through that client experience. So the goal for today is, number one, we want to learn how to combine the proposal, contract, and invoice together so you can send it all out in one sequence. We also want to learn how to customize and send a proposal. I know some of you who are watching, you're more in that custom work area of business. So we're going to talk about customizing proposals before you send them. And then we want to understand the client and business owner experience. What is it like for you as the business owner, and what is the client experience? And then finally, we're going to talk about countersigning contracts as well. And I will add, it's not on this bullet point list, but another thing that we will talk about is how to apply payments manually if you don't have Stripe, Square, or PayPal. So I am going to show you if you accept payments through Cash App or Venmo or Zelle or any other method, cash or check. I'm going to show you how to apply payments manually to invoices if you don't have Stripe, Square, or PayPal. So let's go ahead and dive in. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are the proposal settings, because this is really where the magic happens when it comes to combining the proposal, contract, and invoice together. So let's go ahead and we're going to dive over into Dubsado, and let's first go into the proposal that we were looking at yesterday. So I'm going to start with the standard package proposal that we looked at, and kind of walk through some of the proposal settings on what you can do here. So over on the left-hand side, there's a little gear icon. If you click on that, that's going to open up your form settings. And this is where you can really start to enhance your proposal even further. So the first thing that we'll look at here underneath proposal options is where it says include contract. So if you want to send your proposal and your contract together to the client, you can just toggle this to yes. And then it's going to ask you which one of your base templates, your contract based templates, do you want to add to this proposal? And I'm just going to put my wedding photography contract with it, since this is my wedding photography proposal. So those two things will work together nicely. So I can add that in this space. Now, a question that you might have right now is, what if I want the contract to be different based off of what package they select? There is only one way to add a contract, and that is for the proposal as a whole. You can't really have a different contract depending on what package they choose. However, if you're using invoice smart fields in your contract, what you're going to see when we get into the client experience part is that you can have the invoice smart fields autofill whatever services they pick on the proposal. So you can kind of have an overall generic contract, and then you can have the invoice smart fields do sort of that auto filling of what they choose on the proposal. But we'll get into that later. The next thing is you can say allow client to choose multiple packages, meaning that when the client gets this proposal, and let me remove this here, that's from yesterday. We'll remove that. That just means that when this proposal goes out to the client, do you want them to be able to select more than one package on this form? So in this case, I have my main packages here, and then I also have my add-ons down here. So yes, I do want them to be able to select multiple packages on this form. Now, currently, there's not a way to have certain sections be split up this way. So for example, you can only choose one package out of here, but have multiple packages down here. There's not a way to split it into containers or sections at the moment. This is just for the proposal as a whole. So what you kind of have to do is really guide your client through the experience by actually writing in there, choose one main package, choose any add-ons. So you can kind of guide them with text and directions through the proposal there. But this is for the proposal as a whole. So allow client to choose multiple packages. The next thing is the invoice options. So if I want the invoice to show, because remember with the proposal, what they're essentially doing is they're building their invoice right now. So if I want to show that invoice to the client, I can actually click yes here, and that's going to show them the invoice at the end of the sequence so they can make a payment. It's kind of like on Amazon when you pick what you want and then you go to the shopping cart to pay for it. Same idea here. So I can say include invoice to show that invoice at the end. Now, before I move forward here to the next two, something I do want to make sure people understand is that you can create your own combinations of how you want to do this, meaning that you can do a proposal by itself, you can do proposal contract together, you can do proposal invoice together, or you can do all three. The proposal, though, is sort of the main thing that you have to have in order to do all of these combinations. Right now, there's not a way to just do contract and invoice in one sequence, but we'll talk about how to do that at the end of this webinar. But the main thing to know is that the proposal is the sort of the centerpiece to all of this. And then you can either do contract or invoice or both. So that's how that works there. You can apply discounts if you would like to. We didn't really have time to get into discounts because it's not essential for this particular bootcamp, but you can add discounts to your proposals. And then the last thing here, if you recall from day one, we talked about payment plans. You can add a payment plan to go with your proposal. So if you recall from day one, we set up that payment plan that was $1,000 due up front, and then the rest is due 2 weeks before their project date. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my payment plan, that same $1,000 deposit that we did on day one. I'm going to add that to this proposal. So that way, when they get to the invoice at the end, it's going to have that payment plan also on the invoice. So as you can kind of see from these form settings, you're really kind of creating the client experience from this tab. There's so much that you can do here, so many different combinations. So it's important to kind of craft this how you want your client to experience it. So let me go ahead and save this, because what we're going to do next is we're going to actually go through how to send this out to a client and do all of that good stuff. But before we do that, I do want to share with the handout. If you go over to the next slide here, there is adding a contract and invoice sort of slide here, just as a reminder of how that works. So the next thing that we're going to talk about now is sending out the proposal, contract, and invoice together. So now that we have it set up in the background, now we'll talk about the actual client experience. However, before we do that, there is one sort of side note that I want to make, or teaching moment that I want to have. And I will say that with these next 3 slides, if you take away anything from today's webinar, what we're going to talk about next is probably the most important takeaway from what we're talking about today. So the first thing that I want to talk about is adding a template to a project. The reason I say adding a template to a project is because this sequence that I'm showing you here is how it works for every single template, whether it's a workflow template you're adding to a project, a scheduler template, a canned email template, package template, form template, you name it, contract template. This is how templates work in projects. So how it's broken down is this. Number one, you have your base template, and we've been talking a lot about base templates over these last 3 days. When you add it into a project, what it does is it creates a duplicate of that base template, and then the duplicate goes into the project. So here's what I mean by that. When I'm on my forms page, these are all of my base templates. When I add one of these into a project, it creates a copy of it, and that copy is what goes into the project. Why is this important? Because that means that if I make changes to a template that's in a project, it's only for that project. I'm not changing my base templates here. It's only what's happening in that project. And what that also means is vice versa. I don't need to create all of my different templates for all of the clients on this page. I don't need to have a proposal for Wendy and for James and for Max. I don't need to have all of these templates here. I can have a base template, add it into a project, and then make the tweaks that I need to once it's in that project. So that's a very important concept with Dubsado, because like I said, this is how all templates work. Once you add it into a project, you're now only working on that specific template in that project. So that's number one, very important to know. Number two is how proposals work. So this is a quick back end and client view chart of how proposals work in Dubsado. Now, this is just sort of a graph that you can see how it works, or an infographic on how it works. But once we actually go into Dubsado, into a project, and do these actions, you'll be able to see what this looks like when you're in a project. But let's just walk through this here really quickly. So I have this split up with the client view up at the top there. That's what the client is seeing. And then the back end, what's happening inside of Dubsado, where the client can't see what's happening. So number one, when you add a proposal into a project, what it does is it creates an empty blank invoice inside of the project. The moment that goes in there, an empty invoice gets created. Once you send the proposal to the client and then they submit that proposal, whatever packages they chose on there, whether it's one package, multiple, whatever they're selecting on there, it gets added to the empty invoice that got created back at stage 2. So the invoice technically doesn't get created once they submit the proposal. The invoice is getting created way back when you first add the proposal in. However, once those packages get put on that invoice, then they sign the contract and they can pay their invoice. So the other thing that's really important here is between 4 to 6, when they submit that proposal and then go to the contract, the reason that you can have what they have on their proposal, what they selected on their contract, is because by the time they get here, your invoice is already ready to go. So you're just showing that on the contract so they can go ahead and sign. And again, this will make a lot more sense once we get into a project, but this is really important to understand how the proposal works in Dubsado. And I love analogies. I'm a huge sucker for a great analogy. And so I do want to kind of solidify this maybe a little bit further for those of you who might still say, I don't really get it. Hopefully this example will help out. So let's imagine that you're going to a restaurant. Now, if you remember from yesterday, we talked about how packages are kind of like your food items and the proposal is like your menu. So let's say you go into a restaurant and the moment that you walk in and you sit down at your table, the waiter prints out a blank receipt. So the moment you sit down, before you even gotten the menu, the waiter prints out a blank receipt. Now, once the waiter gives you the menu and you pick and choose what you want, then the waiter will actually put those on the blank receipt that they printed out the moment you walked into the restaurant. I know this is kind of backwards a little bit, but this is how it works in Dubsado. So once you finally get that receipt that has all of your food items on there, that's where you sign the contract or sign the receipt and then you pay. So hopefully this analogy, especially if you're downloading this handout, hopefully this analogy really helps solidify how this works in Dubsado on the back end and then the front end. So with that being said, let's jump back into Dubsado and we're going to walk through how this experience works. So let me jump over to projects. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use the Rachel Green project that we have because I have a little more information in there. So you'll really be able to get the full experience here. So let's say that I want to send out my wedding proposal to Rachel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to forms because I want to send a form to Rachel. So when I click on forms, I'm going to go down here to add new form. And what this is going to do is bring up a list of all of my base templates. So which base template do I want to use here? So if you didn't know this, a little quick tip, you can actually type in here. Wait for my computer or my keyboard to connect. There we go. I can type in here and I can actually pick from here. So I'm going to grab that wedding photography proposal webinar. That's the one that I'm using here. Now, when I do that, it's going to pull up a preview of the form. So what you'll notice is that it has Rachel's name auto-filling in there because if you remember from the base template, I have a smart field in there that's pulling the first name. So once it has this preview here, what I can do is click add at the top. Now, remember what we just talked about where I said, if you click add on here, what that did is it created a copy of my base template. And now if I'm going to do anything to this proposal, it's just for this project and it's not going to change anything about my base template. So I have this here. And now what I can do, and I could just click send and just go ahead and send it out, but there's a few things I want to show you before we actually send it. So again, I could just click send it out, and then it's good to go. But I'm going to exit out of this preview window for just a second to show you a few things. Once I've added it into a project, what you'll notice is a few things. Number one, you'll see that the proposal is now here in the form section, and there's a badge on there that says needs sending, which means it hasn't gone out to the client yet. It's just on the back end, and it's sort of hanging out in this project before I actually decide to send it out. The other thing you'll notice is over here on the left-hand side, the contract also got added in as well. The reason it did that is because, remember, in the settings, I decided to include a contract. So just by adding the proposal in, it's going to pull all of this in for me. And then the last thing that I wanted to show you is, if you remember, once you add a proposal into a project, if we go to the invoices tab, what you'll notice is that a blank invoice has been created now. Here's the payment plan of what we made. Remember, we added a payment plan to this, so the payment plan is on the invoice. But what you'll notice is that this is just a blank invoice in here. There's nothing on it. So even though I haven't even sent the proposal to the potential booking yet, it still has this blank invoice in here waiting for when the client does submit the proposal. So that's really important to know, so it kind of lines up with what we just talked about. Now, the next thing, I'm going to go back to that preview modal. So I'm going to click view, and we'll go back to that same the same area that we were just in. So now what I'm going to do here is I can click send, and that's going to pop up my little email composer. We talked about that when we did sending invoices on day one. But now it has this nice little email composer here. It has the button that's going to take us to the proposal, contract, and invoice. And so I can craft this and then send it out to myself. What I'm going to do is I want to show you a unique way where you can test this out for yourself without sending it to yourself or to the client. So what we can do here is go back to that same view. So we'll go back to the preview here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click copy link. What that does is it copies the exact link to this particular proposal. So once I click copy link, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up what's called an incognito window. So if you're using Google Chrome and you click on file up in your menu, you'll see where it says new incognito window, or if you're in Safari, it's called a private window. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this URL in that incognito window. Now, what I'm going to have to do here really quickly is I'm going to have to switch screens because right now with the platform that I'm using, I can only share one window at a time. So let me actually switch my windows here, and I will pop up the client view of this. So now what you'll see is I pasted that URL into this incognito window, and this is actually what the client experience is going to look like. Now, before we move into this, I want to explain why I did that. The reason why is because when you open up a proposal inside of your Dubsado account, it's going to open it up in the business owner view. We don't want to look at the business owner view. We want to look at the client view. So the only way where you can really see what the client sees and go through that whole experience is one of two ways. Either you open up that form in an incognito window so it sort of hides the fact that you're logged into Dubsado, or you can email it to yourself just like normal. You can click send and email it to yourself. But what you'll want to do is log out of Dubsado first before you open it up in your Gmail or your Outlook. That way, Dubsado can't tell that you're logged in as the business owner, and then you won't be able to actually fully test this or fully go through the experience. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going through exactly what Rachel would be going through as if I were the client. So now we'll move through this so you can kind of see how this works. So first things first, up across the top, you'll see where it says proposal and then contract and then invoice. These are three tabs that are actually going to be those three things that we included. So as I said, when they're going through this sequence, they're not going to different windows or different emails. It's all in one tab. So they don't have any friction in that booking experience. They just move through all of this at one time. So they can go through here, put the picture in there. We talked about the templates and whatnot yesterday. So you can see the bio in there. It says choose one main package. So because this is Rachel Green from Friends, let's just assume that she has some money. So we're going to do the signature package, and we're going to select that. And then let's say we also want to do rehearsal coverage, and we also want to do a first look session. So as you can see, I'm basically just kind of going through and picking what I want. And then down at the bottom, so we say, thank you, we'll be in touch shortly. Down at the bottom, what you're going to see is the total generates down at the bottom. A proposal is strictly only for creating that invoice. So you should only be using proposals when you're ready to actually have that invoice be created and then build out their invoice. So the total is going to generate down here at the bottom of the invoice, depending on what you're selecting here. And then there'll be a submit and next button. And what that does when I click on this is it's going to take me now to the contract. So once they click that at the bottom, they move to the contract. And we talked about this contract yesterday. So now I can go through Rachel Green and Ross Geller, March 1st. It has all of these smart fields that are autofilling. If you remember from yesterday, we talked about those a little bit. So it's autofilling all of the client details because this is inside of their project. So it's pulling their specific client and project details. So now as Rachel, let's say, I can go in, we talked about the initials elements yesterday. So I can initial there. And then here you can see everything that I just did on the proposal is now showing on the contract. The reason why it's doing that is because of those invoice smart fields, where we talked about those yesterday, where it's pulling in the invoice that got created just now. It's pulling that info into the contract for me. So if I chose the essentials package or I chose the elopement package, it doesn't really matter. It's going to pull in that invoice information into my contract for me. So here's my signature package, my add-ons that I have in there. It has the total populating just so they can kind of see that total there. It has the payment plan broken down. Remember, $1,000 is due up front for today. And then July 8th, which is 2 weeks before the project date, it is the rest of the balance is due. So I can initial here as Rachel, and then we'll come down to the signature section. Now we talked about this yesterday as well. There's the client section up here. So as Rachel, I can go through and say Rachel Green and then sign off as Rachel. And then down here, if you remember, this was for the business owner to sign. So if I were to try to sign there, you can see it has the little cancel icon or whatever you call that. So I am not able to sign here as the business or as the client because this is for the business owner. So once I go through, I sign off on all the details. It looks good. I can click agree and submit, and it will take me now to the invoice that got created. So again, like what I was saying, it's kind of like a shopping cart where they get to the end here and here's a breakdown of their invoice. So as I scroll through here, here's the signature package with all the details. The add-ons are all laid out. And then the payment plan, which we kind of looked at this on day one, but you can see the payment plan down here at the bottom. The first payment is due today, and then the second payment is due on 7/8. Now, again, if they're feeling like they want to just pay for everything, let's say Rachel really wants to just get it out of the way and put money down for everything, you can always pay down here at the bottom. But once you click pay now, it will open up the little modal here where you can go through and pay with card, pay with e-check. We talked about all of that on day one. So once they go in here, it will go into the payment processor and then they can make that payment. So even though I just talked through that whole experience, you can see how quick it is to go through, pick what you want in the proposal, takes you to the contract, sign, and then pay. So that's the sequence that the client will go through on their end. Now on the back end, let's jump back over to Dubsado really quickly. So I'm going to unshare my screen and then I will share my Dubsado screen again. Let me pop back over there and we'll go back to where we were. And I'm going to refresh my page so that it pulls in the updates of what's going on. So what you'll see here is now it says the proposal is completed because I just completed it as the client. The contract is over here signed because I just signed the contract. And now if I go to the invoice, what you'll notice is that what I selected on that proposal is now just added onto the invoice. Same thing like what we talked about with that infographic on the proposal flow. It took their selections and put it on that blank invoice. So now, if they would have made a payment on that payment page, then you would be able to see the payment reflected down here at the bottom. However, I'm not actually going to pay $1,000 to the payment processor that's connected. So what I'm going to do now, like what we talked about, I'm going to show you how to apply a fake payment, or I guess technically it could be a real payment if you were doing it this way, if you were using cash or check. But I'm going to show you how to apply a payment to your invoice. So let's say that I wanted to emulate that Rachel paid that $1,000. So I'm going to go up to the top, click on apply, and then payment. And when I click that, it'll open up this modal here where you can put in the information about that payment. So 3-1, let's say that she paid today. So 3-1, and then you put in a payment description if you want to. Let's say that she, I don't know, paid me through Venmo. And then the method, you can choose what method they paid. So we'll just say e-transfer. And then the amount. So we'll just say $1,000 here and click apply. So once I do that, that's going to be the method that if you're accepting cash or check or anything besides Stripe, Square, or PayPal, that's how you apply the payment that they made to your invoice to balance your books out inside of Dubsado. So if I scroll down now, what you'll see is that payment has generated. So 3/1/23, it puts in the little description of what I said in there. So Venmo, $1,000, and then the remainder is there. The other thing that I want to show you regarding the invoice is that if I open up this invoice now, so let's say that I open this up in a new window, like what we talked about on day one, what you'll notice is that on the client's end of the invoice, this is what it now looks like. The first installment is paid, so it's grayed out there. And then you can see the payments on there as well as whatever the remaining balance is. So all a client has to do is just refresh their page or click on the invoice link again, and their invoice will automatically update with the latest information. So that's kind of on the client end what the invoice looks like once they make their payment. And the other thing a client can do is if they want to, let's say, print this out for their records or just download this invoice as a PDF, they can always do that up at the top, which is really nice. If they want to kind of use this as some sort of a receipt, they can kind of emulate that there. Now, back in Dubsado, one other thing I want to show you, and then we're going to move into the custom proposal, customizing it, and then we'll be all wrapped up for the day. So the other thing I want to talk about is how to countersign a contract. So let's say the client has moved through everything they need to. The contract is signed, invoice is paid. Now I need to countersign this contract. Over on the left-hand side where contracts live, if you click this drop down and then click open, you can open this contract as the business owner. Now, what you'll notice, if you want to know if you're in the business owner view or if you're in the client view, there will always be this gold banner that's up across the top. Right now it says it looks like you're logged in as the business owner. So I'm not able to sign this or test this as the client because I'm not in that incognito window like what we were talking about. But with the contract, I can see the initials, all the signatures that they did there. So now down at the bottom, I can go ahead and I'll just put my name in here as the business owner, and I will countersign the contract. Thank you. The form has been submitted, and now my contract is countersigned. And that's all you have to do to countersign a contract. Now, two things with countersigning contracts. Number one is that we don't have a way to just automatically have your signature pre-populated like some of the other contract signing apps. You do have to manually sign your contracts. There's not a way to automatically pull in a signature or a picture of a signature. The second thing is that technically you don't have to wait until the client signs the contract before you countersign. If you want to, before you even send it out to the client, like when this said needs sending, you can technically go in before you even send the contract and just open it and countersign it before you send it. So that is a possibility if you want to do that, but it does have to be signed by you. You can just decide if you want to do that beforehand or after. The other thing that you might have questions on as well is that will the counter signature send an email to the client once I've countersigned? It won't send an email to the client, but what happens is the moment you countersign, the next time the client opens up their contract, your signature will just auto populate in there. So it updates real time, sort of like how the invoice does when they make a payment. So the contract will auto update whenever you countersign the contract for the client. So that's how to countersign your contracts. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about sending a proposal and then sending the contract and invoice later. The reason I want to tackle this scenario is because you might be looking at what we just did and you might say, this is great, but I don't want to send my proposal, contract, and invoice all in one sequence. I want to split it up. I want to do the proposal first. Once that looks good and I look over it, maybe make sure everything looks okay, then I want to send the contract and invoice out separately. So I wanted to include this method because it's really important to know that there are different methods on sending proposals. There's different combinations, and I want to tackle that. The other thing I want to do with this method is I want to talk about how to do this with the custom proposal that we talked about yesterday. So let's jump over to Dubsado again, and we're going to first we're going to remove all of what we just did. So I'm going to remove the contract, the invoice that's in there. I'm going to delete the payment out of there, and then delete the invoice out of there. And this is really good when you're testing things in Dubsado, is really if you're going to use a sample project to remove everything first and just start fresh before you actually go in and do your next testing round. So I remove that proposal, I remove the contract, and there is, oh, whoops, let me go back here. I jumped the gun there. And go back to the invoices. Invoice is gone, and then we'll refresh the page just to make sure everything's good there. And then we'll actually go through and test this out. So let's go back to the proposal here, and we're going to use the catering proposal that we looked at yesterday. This is the custom proposal that we're using for kind of our special event catering. So a couple things before we talk about customizing this. The first thing is that if you're using a custom proposal, you can still do the custom proposal, contract, and invoice all in one sequence. I don't want you to think based off of what we're doing right now that you have to do the proposal, then contract and invoice if you're doing custom work. You can do the same thing as what we just did, where it's a custom proposal, they submit that, contract, invoice. You can still do that same thing if you want to. But the reason I wanted to show this first is so you can see what we're doing right now is we're just sending out the proposal by itself. We're not doing the contract or the invoice together. This is just going to be the proposal that goes out first. The last thing that I want to just double check on and talk through here really quickly, and we talked about it yesterday a little bit, is that remember this is a base template. So this is just what I'm starting out as sort of a placeholder. And then I'm going to customize it here in a second. So on my base template, remember we talked about yesterday, I removed the select button on here and I pre-selected the package. So that way when they get this, they don't have to click select and also click submit and next at the bottom or submit. They don't have to do two things, just one thing. So all of this looks good here. I'm going to save this, and then we're going to go back into Rachel's project and walk through exactly how to do this. So we'll go into Rachel's project, then go to the form section, click the drop down so we can find my catering proposal, and we're going to add this in there. So pulling up a nice little preview here, it says, hello, Rachel, here's a custom quote just for you. When I click add, remember it creates a copy. So now what I can do is I can click edit on this proposal. And what this will do is it's going to open up sort of the same view that we were just looking at, but what you can see up in the top left is that I am editing the proposal just for the Green and Geller wedding. This isn't my base template anymore. So now let's pretend that I got on the phone with Rachel and we had a conversation about what they're interested in as far as catering goes. Now what I can do is before I send this out to her, I can come into the package and I'll click on it. And then up in the top here in the menu, you'll see this little option called Edit Package. If I click that, that's going to open up my line items in this base package. So now what I can do is this. Let's say we got on the phone and she kind of gave me the details of what this is going to look like. I can come in here and I can click this little drop down and click Edit. And now I can customize this particular line item based off of what it was that she said she wanted. So let's say, for example, first of all, let's say that she's going to have 250 people there that are going to be eating. So the quantity, I can just do 250. And then as far as what food is going to be served, I can say appetizer, we'll say breadsticks. Salad, we're going to do a nice Caesar. Entree, let's say we do steak. And then dessert, we're going to go with a chocolate cake. Sorry if no one's eaten lunch yet and you're hungry. I apologize for this. But once we have the description in there, now I can click Save Item. And then that is now logged underneath that line item. So you can see the total has now changed. The next thing is bar service. So let's say I had a conversation with Rachel and she said, we're probably going to have about 105 people, let's say, that are going to be doing the bar service. So when I click this drop down, I can just say quantity 105, 105. And then I can say save item. So now, as you can see, I've customized this particular package, this custom package, just based off of Rachel's specifications. When I'm done, I can click apply and it will save that updated package. And now what I can do is I'll click this little drop down and I'll say save and close. And that's going to take me back to the actual project. So here's my proposal. Remember, it says needs sending, so it hasn't gone out to Rachel yet. If I click view, open up this modal again, what you're going to see is now that updated version of what I just customized is now there. So now I can click send and send it out to Rachel. I'm not going to do send again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the copy link like we did last time. And I'm going to open up my incognito window again. And let me go ahead and switch screens on you one more time. Let me do this here. Exit out of that other window. And we will open up my other window again. Thank you for your patience with this. And now we see the proposal. So as you can see, a couple things here. One, there's just the proposal. There's not contract invoice added on there. It's just the proposal. And here are all of those specifications: breadsticks, Caesar salad, steak, chocolate cake, 250, all the price looks good. And what I was talking about earlier, this package is pre-selected in the background, and there's no select button. So there's nothing that Rachel can do as the business owner to unselect this package or change it. The only thing Rachel can do is just submit it. And that, again, if you remember from yesterday, we talked about if there's any changes that you want to see, go ahead and just send me an email before you submit this. But let's just pretend that Rachel says this looks great and click submit, and then submits the actual proposal. So now if we jump back over to Dubsado again, and we'll pop that screen open and go back there. So now back in Dubsado, if I exit out of this preview window and I'll refresh my page, then what you'll see is that the catering proposal has now turned to completed because I just completed it there. And if I go to the invoice, remember that the invoice is now created with all of the specifications that we just had in there. So the invoice technically is ready to go because the proposal is in charge of building that invoice. Even though I don't have include invoice on the settings selected, that doesn't mean that the invoice doesn't get created. It just means that you're not showing the invoice to them at the end of that sequence, but the invoice is still here in the background on the back end. So now that the invoice is ready to go, here's what I can do. I want to send my contract and invoice now out to the client. So when I click this drop down, I'm going to choose my catering contract. So we'll click that and open that up. And what you'll see here is it's sort of a similar thing to what I had with my wedding photography contract. It has kind of all the terms and conditions in there of what we just talked about. It's pulling that invoice information in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click add. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click send on the contract. And what this is going to do is it will open up that email composer. Remember, once you click send, this will pop up for you. And what you'll notice is that it links the contract that you chose on there. You said send, and then it pops open that contract. Now, I also want to include the invoice in this email. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click into the email composer. And we talked about this a little bit during the Q&A session yesterday, but if I want to include more than one template in here, I can actually include anything from this project in this email. What I can do is I can click this little list icon down here in the bottom, and that's going to populate all of the templates that are in this particular project right now. So I can go down to the invoice and click it, and it's going to add that to this particular email. So like I said previously, there's not a way to have the contract and invoice tab together at the top like what you see with the proposal. That's only if you're using a proposal to tie all of that in. If you're wanting to do contract and invoice separately, all you have to do is add the contract in and then click send, and then you can add the invoice that is created in the project. You can add it with this little list icon in here and just add it into the email. So that is how you can do proposal and then have them submit it and then contract and invoice at a later time. So to wrap everything up, and then we'll dive right into the Q&A, is that the homework for today, as you can probably imagine, is to send out a proposal, contract, and invoice to yourself in a sample project so you can kind of test it and get familiar with how it works. When you're comfortable with that, go ahead and send out your proposal, contract, and invoice and get a booking. So to wrap everything up with this boot camp, the biggest things to pay attention to here are getting your settings set up, understand obviously clients and projects. Then you want to make sure you get your services and payment plans into Dubsado. Then it's all about getting that proposal, contract, and invoice together. And once you do that, you're able to send it out, and then you can start getting those clients booked. So awesome. We will jump in and answer questions now. We wrapped up in, let's see, it was about 40 minutes, I believe, or a little bit longer than that. Actually, it was a little bit closer to an hour, but we'll spend some time and we'll answer your questions. If you have them, go ahead and write them in the Q&A section. If you're in Big Marker, just click on Q&A and then just fill them in there, and I'll go through and look at them there. And then if you're in YouTube, I will also try to look over at the YouTube stream to see if there are any questions or anything like that. So feel free to write some questions in the chat on YouTube. So let me go to the Q&A section. We'll start knocking out some of these questions here. So first question, if you're using the proposal as a public proposal, almost like a lead form, but then want to send the invoice and contract together after they submit the proposal, would you add the invoice to the proposal as you initially have shown? So what I would do there, Clarissa, is kind of like we just talked about right there at the end. The public proposal, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a way where you can take the proposal and embed it on your website, and it sort of acts like a proposal and a lead capture form together. We didn't really talk about that, obviously, during the boot camp, but to answer your question, Clarissa, once they fill out that public proposal and you have the project get created, the invoice is already in that project now. So now all you need to do is just go into the project, add the contract, click send, and then include that invoice link at the bottom, and it will send it all out for you. So that public proposal, once they're done with that, you don't even need to include it anymore. They're done with that portion. Now just focus on sending out the contract and invoice together, like what I was talking about. So hopefully that answers your question there. Let's see. All right, let me back up here. Okay, next question. When you include the contract, does the contract show up after they submit the proposal and the invoice too? Yes. So that structure that we looked at, the proposal, contract, and invoice, that will always be the sequence that they go through. There's not a way to change that sequence around. It's always proposal first. That sort of makes the invoice, contract, where they can see what was on that invoice potentially and sign off on the terms, and then it will actually show the invoice to them at the end. So it's always going to be that sequence there. Can I set a proposal expiration date to be a certain number of days from when it was sent? There's not a way at the moment, Kyle, to do from when it was sent, only applied to the project. So here's what I recommend doing, and this is almost kind of a workflow thing as well, is your proposal should only be getting added into the project when you're ready for that invoice to be created. And that should technically kind of be the same time that you're planning on sending the proposal as well. You should really only have that proposal being introduced into the project when you're ready to send it, because that's when the invoice gets created. That's when the expiration dates, like what you're saying, that's a trigger that you can use. So I would definitely recommend only adding the proposal to the project when you're ready to send it. And workflow related, it's kind of the same idea. You should really build your workflows in phases so that the proposal gets introduced only when you're ready for it to go out to the client. So hopefully that helps. But at this time, that's not a trigger that we have with expiration dates. Let's see. I've added an email to another project by accident. So far, I haven't been able to find a way to undo it and to put it in the correct project. How would I go about doing that? So currently, right now, there's not a way to move emails from one project to another. So what you technically would need to do is you would just need to continue your communication in the correct project. As far as sending forms or sending emails, there's not a way to pull that email out of one project and stick it in another one at the moment. A lot of that has to do with the email connections and replies and the email that it was sent to and all of that sort of behind the scenes on how it's tracking where the threads are going. So what I would just recommend in that situation is just moving forward, do all of your communication in the right project. Now, one thing you can do if you send it to the wrong client potentially, you can, if we go back over to Dubsado, let me actually do one thing here before I jump back over there. What you can technically do is any email communication that you have done, you can move over to the right-hand side. So let's say this email here, I wanted to just remove it out of the project. Over on the right-hand side, you can technically click this little trash can icon and delete that thread from the incorrect project. It won't undo, obviously, the email that's sent in the actual email inbox, but at least from a project perspective, it would get rid of that email in the project. But unfortunately, there's not a way to move emails in between projects at the moment. Let's see here. Next question. Is there a way to update quantities of itemized products in the proposal? For example, number of invitations and insert cards. So there is a way to do it. And I'll talk about two things here. If we look at the proposal, so let me go to the forms, and I'm not sure, by the way, which one you're referring to. Can a client choose the quantities, or can I change the quantities once they've submitted it on the back end? But I'll show you both. So on the proposal, what you'll notice here is one of my add-ons isn't a select button, it's a quantity box. So if we open up this particular package, something that you can do here is you don't have to use a select button for your buttons to click on. You can also, if you scroll down on package smart fields, you can also use a quantity box. You can use a checkbox, a large one or a small one, or you can use the button, which is your select button. So there are some different ways that you can kind of customize what type of button you're using, but you can use a quantity box, which is what I have here. And so what happens is that when the client gets this, they can choose how many additional hours of coverage, and they can actually plug in a number there, and they can put in how many they want. So for invitations and insert cards, if you want them to, actually put in how many they want there, you can use a quantity box instead. Now, to update this, let's say that, they get done with everything and they say, actually, instead of doing 100, I only want to do 50. If you go into their project, and we'll go into Rachel's here, on the invoice that got created. So let's say this premium bar service, let's say that they don't want to do 105 anymore. They actually realize that 150 people are going to drink. So if we click this drop down here, let's click this, and then we can update this to 150. Sorry, 150. And then click save item. And now it's going to just update the invoice. And the cool part about this is now on the invoice, if we refresh the page, and let's say I'm the client, oh, I actually deleted that invoice. That's the old invoice. Sorry about that. If we open this up again, it will actually update to 150 after they made the payment and did all of that. So you can either just update the quantity in the invoice if that's what you're wanting to do, or if you're wanting the client to select quantities, you can use a quantity box on your proposal if that works for you. Let's see here. Can I set up e-transfer in the available payment options? Yes, you can do e-check, but we kind of talked about it a little bit on day one. The only way you can do e-check is if you're using Stripe as your payment processor, and e-check is technically right now only available with US banks. So there is kind of a specific niche that you have to fit into in order to use that option. But if you do want to use e-check, it'll have to be through Stripe as your payment processor, and it does have to be US banks right now. So that's kind of a specification on that. Let's see here. When you set a payment as TBD, for example, 5 days after a contract is signed, is Dubsado working on making it dynamic? So once the contract is signed, it automatically populates the date in both the contract and invoice. It actually does do that. So here's the tricky thing, and I kind of know what you're talking about here with the proposal, contract, and invoice. Let me do this here. I know we have a little bit of extra time, so let me break down what you're referring to there. So let me delete this. And let me delete the proposal here. And I'll show you kind of what we're talking about. So let's say that my payment plan isn't 0 days after payment plan is applied to invoice. Let's say that this is, like, we'll use the exact same example, 5 days after contract is signed by client. We'll change that deposit to match that specific scenario. So now that I have this, if I go back to my projects, I'll go into Rachel here and I'll refresh the page. And when I go to my proposal, I'll grab that wedding proposal again and click add. We'll kind of go through that same sequencing there. Copy link. And then let me go ahead and switch my screen here really quickly. Again, thank you all for bearing with me. They don't make it easy to switch between windows very well. So let me open this up here. So this is kind of what you're referring to and how the question is formatted. So remember, my payment plan is 5 days after contract is signed by client. So when I go here and I click select, let's say I'm building out my invoice and then click submit it next. Right now, if I look at my payment plan, it says TBD 5 days after contract is signed by client. So there's not really a date that gets put in there. And the reason for that is because technically the payment isn't due until after they sign their contract, or 5 days after. So they could go to the contract right now and decide, I don't really want to sign it. So there's not a way to say 5 days from today. If they sign their contract today, we can't really do that. So what I usually recommend doing is that you can either do it this way, where you have the contract signed and you set it up that way, or you can technically use what I just used, which is after payment plan is applied to invoice, which means today, because I applied the payment plan today. And then it could be 5 days from today's date. So if you're always needing today's date to populate, you can do it that way. But right now, because there's technically not a way to actually plug in a date, haven't even signed the contract yet, you can't really do that. The other thing, and this is not necessarily ideal, but you don't have to put the payment plan necessarily in the contract. They'll see the payment plan when they get to the invoice. I know it's not best business practice there, but that's technically the only thing that you can do if you're using the payment plan smart fields, or the invoice smart fields for payment plan, because it's 5 days after the contract is signed, but technically they haven't signed it yet, so it can't even put in a date. However, if I do go through this, and let's say I actually sign the contract as the client, we'll plug this in and say Rachel Green, and then click submit. On the invoice side of it, though, that's going to update with the right date, which is 5 days from today, 3/6. So that's going to autofill correctly there. But when they first get to that contract, it's not really going to show there. So that is kind of a tricky scenario. I don't really know from a programming standpoint how you would fix that necessarily. That's not really my wheelhouse or area of expertise, but I can see what you're talking about there. How do we give my client access to their client portal? Let's jump back to Dubsado. I'll switch my screens again for you so we can take a look at that. And we won't deep dive into client portals completely, but I can show you here really quick. So down at the bottom left, you'll see the portal option of a client's profile. When you click this little drop down arrow, if your portal is deactivated, you might see deactivated or not active as the status. You would first need to activate the client portal so that the client can actually go into it when they get the info. But when you click the drop down, you can click send, and that's going to send them their portal information once you actually email it. So that's how you can send that out to the client. How do you recommend learning CSS basics? So April, to be completely transparent with you, I don't know anything about CSS, so I don't personally have anywhere to start with it. But what I am going to send to you in the chat is, let me open this up. And we have a help article actually that one of my colleagues who does know CSS, let me plug this in. This is sort of a cheat sheet for how you can get started with CSS. So there's some things on there that might be beneficial to you. So go ahead and check that out. But that is what I would say is kind of the baseline for CSS. Hopefully that helps you out, but I'm sure there's probably some YouTube videos and things like that. YouTube University is the best place to go to learn things like that, but you can definitely probably learn some basics there, but definitely check out our help article first because it's kind of crafted for our form builder. So hopefully that helps there. Let's see. Can you remind me of the step? Set up packages, then proposals, contracts, invoices. Yes. So as far as the whole boot camp goes, to kind of give you a framework and a layout of what to do, let me actually go back to my 3-day agenda because the agenda is probably the best outline of how to go through everything. First thing is the essential settings. You have to get your email set up, payment processor. Those are kind of the non-negotiables there. Projects and clients, you don't really have to get those set up necessarily, but packages, so get your services in, payment plans, lead capture forms. Technically, you don't have to have your lead capture form set up to get a booking, but obviously you want to have something where you can start collecting leads to get them booked. So I did put lead capture forms in there. So packages, payment plans, contracts, proposals, and then you're good to go. So hopefully that makes sense, kind of about the things that you have to set up, but that's probably the best rundown of how to kind of go through and get everything set up there. Let's see, can I turn a proposal into a questionnaire and vice versa? As far as the functionality goes, Allison, you can't really swap them in and out, but here's technically what you can do. If you made, let's say, a proposal that you would rather have it be a questionnaire and you're going to use it as a questionnaire, technically what you can do is you can click and drag and you can add the catering proposal over as a questionnaire. Now, I would not move it over into questionnaires if you're still planning on using it as a proposal, because that's not going to work the way that you're wanting it to. What I always say about moving templates from one area to the other, you should only do that if you're trying to use the same design on something and then format it for the purpose that it was designed for. So for example, here's a really popular one. Some people create questionnaires thinking that they're lead capture forms. And so they'll make an intake form over here that they want to embed on their website, that they want to use as a lead capture form. The simple thing to do there is you can just click this and drag it over to lead capture forms, and then you can use it as a lead capture form if you set it up in that way. But that is probably the most common example, but what you really shouldn't do is take a proposal, move it to, let's say, sub-agreements and try to use it as that, because it won't work from a functionality standpoint in that way. But technically you can under certain circumstances there. Let's see. What if on a day of service, extra hours are requested by the client? Can we stay later on site? Can a second contract be sent or a second invoice? Or how would you edit the current signed contract? Phenomenal question, Shannon. So what I would recommend doing, because you don't want to delete, well, actually, let me back up. Contracts, once they're signed inside of a project, so let me jump to Rachel's signed contract here. Once a contract is signed, you cannot make any changes to it. It is completely locked. This is more of a security thing. So as the business owner, you can't say, no, actually you said $10,000, not $1,000. So contracts are fully locked whenever you sign them. What you would want to do is you can use a sub agreement so that you can get another signature from them, sort of like a contract amendment. So I would just have a sub agreement for situations like that. And if you're on site, you can just go into their project and pull up a sub agreement and have them sign off on those terms. So that's probably the best way of doing it. If you want to pull in invoice smart fields on that sub agreement, you can, so it shows the most updated version of the invoice. And here's what I would say about the invoice. You could do one of two things. If they're wanting to, have you stay later or add on services, you can do one of two things. You can either just add another line item onto this invoice, which is probably the easiest way of doing it. Just add a quick line item and then send the sub agreement to them so they can sign off on the new terms. Or you could go up to invoice list, and then you can click add and create a brand new invoice and have them pay on that invoice. Me personally, I would say just add another line item onto the invoice that's already created, so it's all just on one invoice there, and then use the sub agreement to have them sign off on the additional terms. And what else is great about that is that now you have their original contract in the project, and you also have their sub agreement or their updated contract in here as well. So you have both versions, just in case the client tries to be funny and they say, I didn't say that on my first contract. You still have it in the project just to save yourself. So keep both of them in there. One's a contract. The next one is a sub agreement. Let's see here. Is there a similar seminar for setting up workflows next? Clarissa, I am actually going to be creating a workflow workshop that we actually did last year, maybe 2 years ago by now. I am going to be doing the same thing about setting up a workflow. So that will be coming. I don't have dates locked in, but I'm very excited about that. We'll be putting some stuff out once I get some things together as far as teaching materials and handouts and templates and all that good stuff. But I definitely am going to be doing a workflow workshop at some point during this year. Let's see. How does it work if you have your client business, or business, but when it comes to invoicing, it goes to their billing department? So client number 2. So what you would want to do there, this is a little tricky. What I would probably do, and it also depends on who you want to sign the contract as well, but let me kind of break this scenario down. What I would probably do is in the proposal, I would do proposal with a contract attached only. So what they would do is they would go through the proposal and sign the contract. Let's say client number 1 would go through that. And then once they've done that, remember the invoice is created now. So then once they've done the proposal and the contract, everything is good to go and you need to send the invoice to the billing department, I would just go into the invoice. Let's say this is what they did from the proposal and everything looks good. I would click send, and you can actually change who this goes to. So I can remove this out of here. It's not going to put the primary client in there, and I can put in whoever the email for the billing department is. I can plug that into the to section here and just send the invoice to them through this project, and it's still going to get logged in the project, all of that good stuff. But anytime you're wanting to send something to a different person that's not the primary client, you can always just go into the project, click send on the template you're wanting to send, and then plug in whoever it needs to go to there. It doesn't have to go to the primary client. So that would be my recommendation. Again, I'm not sure who the contract needs to go to in this scenario, but maybe you do proposal contract together and then send the invoice separately, or you could do proposal by itself and then do like what we did today, do the contract and invoice to the billing department. I don't know if they would sign off on it, but hopefully that helps out there. Let's see. I think I just missed it, but can you clarify what you said? Is there an ability to have an older or previous versions of the contract in case I need to make an edit? Yes. So you want to keep your main contract here, but anytime that you want someone to sign on an amendment or the terms change, during COVID, this was huge because, weddings got canceled, but they didn't want to delete that old contract. They wanted to have them sign off on new dates, new terms. Use a sub agreement for that, and you'll do it from the form section. So if I have, let's say, my contract here, what I would do is I would go down to, let's say, my contract amendment, which is a sub agreement. And then on this sub agreement, I can have, whatever the terms and conditions, like, this is the new date that they're going to be doing things on, and I can send this to them. That way I have the sub agreement on file, and their original contract is still on file as well. So that's the best method there if you want to keep both. So awesome, awesome, awesome. That was the last question that I saw, at least in the Q&A section. Let me just check YouTube. It doesn't look like we have any questions over there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you all go so you can get those proposals going, test things out to make sure that they're working the way you want them to. Hopefully this workshop and this boot camp has been really informative. The main thing is that I want you all to feel confident in moving forward in Dubsado. Once you have your services and products in there, you have your proposal and contract ready, you can see how easy it is to just send things out to the client and use the platform manually. One thing that I always like to mention before I close with these is that you don't have to have a workflow set up in order to use Dubsado. As you can see, I didn't use workflows at all during these 3 days. I can use the system manually while I get bookings and while I use the system. And then while I'm doing that and I'm comfortable with that process, I can work on my workflows later, or I can slowly get those built out. So don't think that you have to have workflows set up or you need all this fancy automation just to use Dubsado. You can literally just set up your proposal contract and then send it out to the client and get those bookings in. So thank you all so much. I appreciate you for attending these 3 days and rocking with me for the workshop. We'll definitely be doing more workshops and boot camps like this in the future. So I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and we will see you again soon. Take care, everybody.